Welcome to the Canadian Gender Wars Report Weekly. My name is Shannon Boucher. You can find me at Shannon B. Douglas on Twitter. I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host and producer, Melanie Bennett. Melanie and I are going to chat about the big stories in the gender wars in the past week in Canada. And we're looking forward to a huge week, perhaps the biggest week so far this year, coming up with marches on the 20th, all across Canada, with a protest on the 22nd in Toronto. With Billboard Chris and Josh Alexander. We've got Heather Mason on Saturday, who's going to be holding a protest. If you've ever seen the acronym KPSS, that means Keep Prison Single Sex. Heather Mason is with the organization CAUSEBAR, that's Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, and she's going to be hosting a protest in Windsor on Saturday. So all through the week, there's going to be big events, including Melly and I doing a panel or town hall meeting with Scott Nugent, who's an activist, a pro-parent activist, a trans-identified woman who was, rushed through and sold a bill of goods on sex change, and has had unbelievable, egregious complications. Just before I hand the floor to Melanie, big picture, we're going to cover off some things this week. There's some new stuff coming from Angus Reid that we think is really interesting, and the Quebec Education Minister has made some statements about gender this week. Then we're going to touch on the books in Peel. There's been a weeding based on some sort of woke and progressive policies. And then we're going to give some plugs to our friends across the country who are helping to organize the Million for Children March. Melanie, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. A little bit hectic as things progress, but doing really well. I found it difficult to keep up with all of the events happening. Like you say, there's certainly been a lot going on. And so, it was quite a challenge to pick what were the top stories to go over today. But like you said, there has been more from Angus Reid. And I think that I read, don't quote me on this, but I believe that I read that this is going to be part of a wider report on the wider gender wars, or not gender wars, pardon me, the culture wars. And there's been some releases of data over the past couple of weeks, and the newest one talking about Canadian culture mindset, and it places Canadians among five different categories of where they stand in the culture wars. It's certainly very interesting to look at the numbers. Do you want to maybe go over the categories first, and then I can talk a little bit about the numbers per province?
Sure. So there's 5 categories, and similar to what Angus Reid came up with a couple of weeks ago around the public sentiment in Canada around keeping gender transition or social transition secret at school, where only 14% of those surveyed said that was a good idea. And about 78% of the public said, no, you can't keep secrets like that from parents. It's too important. Indicating that there's only a small number, or relatively small number of people in the country that feel this way. So the breakdown is this. Zealous activists, those are the progressive left activists, the anti-racist, the decolonized people, the protect trans kids groups. 17% of the population. That's about 1 in 6, 1 in 7, 1 in 6. We've got 26%. They're the quiet accommodators. So these people are kind of the bystanders, or the go along to get along people they're leaning towards the left, and we might speculate that they're compassion hijacked. They're kind of buying into the overall narrative. Then we've got the conflicted middle, people who are unsure about what's going on in either way, 18%. 19% are frustrated skeptics. These are people kind of still in the middle. And then there are 20% of us, people like us, defiant objectors. And I might lump in there the freedom movement, the parents' rights movement, the pushback against these really organized activists coming from the far left, those zealous activists.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is it broke it down per province. And I won't go through each one of the provinces, but I found it interesting because when we think about the zealous activists, we're thinking about those counter protesters. They often appear to be in very large numbers. And certainly right now on social media, as we approach the Million for Children marches, they are becoming more and more vocal. You have groups like Anti Hate Canada or Horizon in Ottawa who are very vocal. And we often get the impression that they are much more numerous than they are. But they would very much be in the category of zealous activists. And for example, here in Ontario, the Angus Reid report states that they're 21%. And the quiet, oh, pardon me, sorry, they're 19%. And the quiet accommodators, which may also show up at protests or sympathize, are 26%. And so they're just under half of the population in Ontario, but in other provinces, that's even less. So, for example, in Alberta, that's 17 for the 70% for the zealous activists and 20% for the quiet accommodators, which means 2/3 ish of the rest of the population are either sort of in the middle or really not for it. And so, um, it paints a broader picture to give us a better idea of where the country stands on the so-called culture wars. And the picture for defined objectives like us is actually quite positive. And it'll be interesting to see if there's more data coming, I don't know, in the future, maybe months or a year in the future, to see if and how that may have changed due to some of the things that are going on recently, especially with the Conservatives over the weekend. So, yeah, I think the point of this is that it seems sometimes like the entire country is a zealous activist, but in reality, that's really not the case, or it doesn't appear to be the case.
I think, the big problem is that these activists have been trained in universities over the last several decades. There are courses in universities in Canada and the States that require some kind of activist engagement in order to support credit, right? Kind of like getting volunteer hours for kids in high school. So, so professors, especially in the humanities and the gender studies departments and the areas of university that are really pushing this, they're encouraging their students to become zealots and giving them tools and academic credit to do it. And what's happened over the last number of years, this is called praxis, by the way. So for people who haven't gone down the rabbit hole like Melanie and I have, praxis is the kind of the marriage of practice and activism, and it is. We see the power fists. The learn, disrupt, rebuild was a draft of the Hamilton school policies on inclusion and diversity. We see this word disrupt over and over again. The Ottawa school boards around disrupt with the gender and the pride movement. The idea is to break down the systems that we currently have to bring about critical consciousness. Now we're going to talk a bit about that in a minute as we get to what's happening in Peel libraries, because a big part of the effort or the reason behind was to ensure what's called critical consciousness. What's going on in Peel, Melanie?
Okay, let's have a little look. So, Peel Region was in the headlines this week for removing quite a few books from their libraries. There were some photographs of libraries looking nearly empty. And I think this surprised a lot of people. It surprised me, frankly, to see it. And let me just so basically the idea is that these books, I believe it was any books previous from 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah, any books older than 15 years were weeded out. This is the term that they use. This is not my term. Perhaps it's a library term. I'm not sure, but they were weeded out of the libraries. So these books include things like A Very Hungry Caterpillar. I think there was a Diary of Anne Frank, certainly 1984, which the irony is not lost on me in this case. And we ask ourselves, well, why did this happen? And I I have a document here which explains from Peel, which explains the rationale behind the weeding of the books, and it says the equitable curation cycle is a 3-step process that holds Peel staff accountable for being critically conscious of how systems operate so that we can dismantle inequities and foster practices that are culturally responsive and relevant. Our goal is to promote success and well being for all students. Then our learning environments and experiences must be rooted in their identities and experiences. So, what this is telling us is that anything 15 years or older is somehow no longer appropriate.
Yeah, in 1984, this was called memory holing, right? So if for those of you who might need a little refresh, I read 1984 again this spring, and memory holing is basically the rewriting or the erasing of history. It's
Yes.
basically tossing it in the bin and writing something in its place. And this idea of critical consciousness and systems. So from these people, we get systemic oppression. So critical consciousness is the state of, let's call it indoctrination, where a person just normally and schools and activist teachers and unions want to imbue critical consciousness in children. That's their objective. This comes from, if I'm not mistaken, Paulo Freire, who is a South American Marxist pedagogical or theory of education guy. And he ruined the education system of the country that he was in. Critical consciousness is a skepticism, a bitterness, and a resentment, and a willing to find problems by deconstructing systems. So it's a way of you know, nitpicking, let's say. I was in a relationship for too many years where my my ex had critical consciousness and read negative intentions into everything I did. Assumed the worst about our relationship, and 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 that led ultimately to the breakdown. And that critical consciousness is to see racism everywhere. It's to see colonialism and the evils of colonialism everywhere. To see anti-LGBT, to see hate, to see all of these things. That's critical consciousness. So um, the people obviously had their critical consciousness glasses on when they just decided it was going to be easier to weed everything out before 2008 because it was rife with Eurocentrism and white supremacy and all of these, like the actual memory and history of our country.
Yeah, and I'll summarize that a little bit. So to put context in what I'm going to read next. So what you're discussing is the theoretical framework is known as theory or critical theory. And under that, you have things like critical race theory, queer theory, anti colonial, anti racism, so on and so forth. But it's just known as theory. Well, that's theory. That is in the academics. What we're talking about is that you mentioned earlier, the application of that theory, the practical application, the applied theory is praxis. And so putting into practice theory. And this is what's happening in Peel schools. Lucky for us, they're being very, very explicit in their own documentation. And here they say these resources are being weeded because they're causing harm. A little bit later, it says, if they're not suitable for Western learners, they're not suitable for any learners, regardless of their race, social, economic status, geographic location, first language, religion, housing situation, etc. It would be best for folks to fundraise and donate books that are inclusive, accurate, culturally relevant, and responsive, especially when donating to folks who have been historically colonized, oppressed, exploited, and marginalized by the Western world. I find that very interesting because they mention here accurate, that somehow um, Very Hungry Caterpillar is not accurate, or a fiction book like 1984 is no longer culturally relevant. It is no longer culturally appropriate because it does not follow theory. It does not practice critical consciousness, and therefore it must be removed. And that's what you were mentioning. That's what you talked about when you said the erasure of history.
Absolutely. And this is not an uncommon tactic, right? Like I remember my high school textbooks from grade 12 history class. And I remember images of like giant fires in town squares in Germany where they were burning books. And they were burning books that were inconsistent with the narrative history of the Third Reich. And what we're doing now is we're doing exactly the same thing with the history that's inconsistent with the practitioners of theory, these radical activists, or the zealous activists, as Angus Reid called them. Um, it, it, you know, it, there's no consistency or logic to the way these people argue, right? Because one of the things that brought me into this world um, was like this activist world, being a defiant objector, was what happened to Carolyn Brzezinski. So we got word. So I'm in the underground today. This is literally a stone wall that was built in 1904 in the basement of my new place, and literally and figuratively, part of the underground of the last couple of years, like we got a kind of a call to action when Carolyn Brzezinski was censured and censored by the Waterloo Region District School Chair, Trustee Scott Piatkowski. Carolyn was objecting to graphic books depicting sex acts in K to 8 schools available to children, as well as ones available to the same age group, trivializing sterilization and medical gender sex change, puberty blockers. Highly controversial, but she was basically tossed from the meeting. Her mic was cut, and then she was defamed by the board. Now, Carolyn's not alone, although she was one of the first in Canada to stand up to a board like this and become, sort of a focal point for support, and to in a way that illuminated the toxicities of these boards. These boards are the people in the States accusing parents of trying to burn books, for getting age inappropriate materials out of the classrooms, accusing them of being. I mean, there were cases in the States where school boards called the FBI on parents and labeled them terrorists.
Yeah.
And last year we saw all kinds of antics with school boards. Being in the underground, there was this thing about Peel and the book purges circulated in late May and June. Uh, there was notes, there was rumors, there was some anonymous teachers that were leaking information into the networks about what was going on, but nothing hit the news. And what really surprises me about this story is that CBC broke it, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, for viewers and listeners, Peel Region is the second largest school board in Canada, and it has a recent history of high dysfunction where the board was actually disbanded because they were such a mess. So they are hyper woke. They are dominated. The administration, the leadership, the superintendents are part of that zealous activist group, and the unions are all supporting in that left activism as well. So we've got a radical left that's controlling our education system, that's burning books in our kids' school libraries. That's
Well, they're weeding them. I don't know that they're
okay. So
burning them, but
we're being
let's be generous.
they're landfilling them and composting them. And there was something about, gosh, I can't reference it, but there was something about using the ashes from the books as fertilizer for like
Oh,
rejuvenation.
well, I didn't come across that. How interesting. That's interesting because after everything you've just said, the last thing I wanted to mention about the Peel book weeding was in their document. They say very specifically that during the process of curation, it is imperative to acknowledge and embrace the possibility of discomfort, which is interesting because, as you say, there's been a lot of histrionics around the idea of banning books. Like, how dare the far right extremists wish to ban books? We've been here, Nazis have done this, oh, blah, 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 blah. And yet they're saying that people who object to sexualized books or the removal of books that are more than 15 years or more than 15 years old somehow we must embrace our own discomfort. Um,
Yeah,
the
because
irony is
well,
not lost on me.
that's a sign of our bigotry and our transphobia and our white supremacy, right? And
Yeah.
that means that they're doing a good job, and the fact that people are upset about it is a sign to them that they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
And embracing your discomfort means shut up and just take
Do
this.
as you're told.
Yeah, yeah. These things do they are getting quite scary. But there's some good news in the education world with respect to gender in Canada. So over the last several months, and I got a call from someone close to Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick, and we're helping to compile a report for them about risks and harms of gender affirming care and legal liabilities and things like that, which is going to be kind of cool. But so we've had New Brunswick first, then we had Manitoba Premier announce that likely the parents' rights issue is going to be a platform in her election campaign. Their election is October 3rd. Just a couple of days later, Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, has stood up. He's actually said in the last week that in order to, basically shut down a lawsuit funded by Egal Canada, he might invoke the notwithstanding clause and just basically say, do as you're told. Kind of neat. But the big one, another education minister, on top of Lecce and Ford, is in Quebec, and he has said that he doesn't want to make this a political issue, which I think is the smartest move so far. Everyone else has got lumped into partisan politics on this, and he said, we're not going to convene a panel. We want an independent investigation." Um, and
Yeah.
to me,
And
it sounds like it's going in the right direction.
absolutely. So, about the previous topic, you mentioned that it was one of the mainstream medias that broke the story. Was it CBC? And in this case, where I read this was actually with Global News, with their headline: Quebec Education Minister rejects hearing on gender identity, prefers expert panels. And the details are that Quebec's education minister says he won't convene a legislative committee on gender identity because he says doing so so doing so exposes this sensitive issue to political exploitation, which is what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, Bernard Drainville says he's open to creating a panel of experts to study the issue. Now, that could be extremely positive. There was obviously the Cass review in the UK, but that doesn't say what panel of experts they're considering, simply that they're considering it. And so there's positivity here, but we must remain cautiously optimistic as well,
Yep.
because it seems that my opinion on this would be that we do need a review. We need a review of the science, and we need one that is in line with the international reviews that have been done. Uh, but here in Canada, we know that our institutions, including our academic institutions in the sciences, are captured. And so it'll be interesting to see how this develops and what sort of expert panel they put together on this issue.
Well, if they bring in activists on a panel, you're just going to get more of the same. And the hope is that a review would include some of at least the findings and the of the various countries who have put the brakes on these practices, right? So last summer, the Attorney General of the United Kingdom, I forget her name. She's actually got a really cool name. Said that teachers could have a liability if they're socially transitioning kids at school. That parents and therapists need to be involved, and that if teachers in schools were going to do this, then there could be legal consequences and serious ones. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, France. Did I say Sweden? They've all pumped the brakes. And in
Yeah.
lots of these countries have said when they did the systematic evidentiary review, which is the gold standard of independent review, that's of all the literature, that do the benefits outweigh the harms here? And in fact, the harms seem to outweigh the benefits of these practices. So hopefully, the Quebec minister can put together an independent review, at least of the meta literature that these other countries have produced in order to come up with some policies. I think that at a federal level, what Polyev should be doing is calling for that evidentiary review. He could sidestep this issue just as easily from a political standpoint, at least the medicalization thing, and say, look, there's too many questions here. Let's get the top scientists
Yeah.
involved. Let's get activism out of this. Let's get the institutions that have been captured and who are activists away from this issue. And let's look at it in a sober and adult way. You know, when we get into populist against populist, which is kind of, I've talked about this for a number of weeks now. We have political and policy people in this movement, and we have populists. And the populists, I think, are a good cohort of those defiant objectors, and they're a good cohort of the activists, the zealous group, right? That's populism. It's not necessarily tied to real science or really grounded policy making. It's more about intuition and more about feeling and frustration. And so we've got these highly polarized ends. But what we need to do is we need to bring it into the middle, and we need to answer the questions in a sensible way and create sensible policies based on science.
I'd really like to see political leaders work at bringing people together in discourse. That's what I'd like to see, because I feel like not only is there more and more division in society, but the actual leaders who are meant to, or in my opinion, a good leader unites. But
Agreed.
all of our leaders
Agreed.
in all of the parties are dividing. I cannot think of one that is not doing this. They are on the attack, they are dividing people. They're certainly partaking in the culture wars. And we could really do with unity. We could really do with opening up the floor for intelligent discourse, for good faith discussion with people that we don't necessarily agree with. Because right now it seems that the most divisive voices are getting the most attention. And look, I'm not perfect. I've certainly had my fair share of getting into scuffles. But then again, I'm not a political leader. I'm not leading a major political party in this country. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. Did you catch Pierre Poilievre's speech from the convention last week?
In bits.
Yeah, I got bits as well. Um, More so than, and this may be just my opinion and what I've seen, and certainly lots of people disagree with me, but I think that more so than Trudeau or Singh, Polyev is trying to create a Canadian narrative. I think one of the important things he said last weekend was that Canadians need to be proud of. We need to be proud of our history and our identity. Canada is a great country, and we need to take some cues from the people of Quebec who are proud of their culture and identity. We don't need to be ashamed of that. And to me, that starts to bring everybody together under the Canadian flag and as people
Yeah.
who are Canadians. And our history hasn't always been a beautiful one. There have been bumps and tragedies and scandals and like any country, but we can we can aspire together to something greater, and I hope that that's the kind of messaging that we'll see more of in the coming months or so. Now, to your point as well, Melanie, you and I have been working with people across the country for the last couple of months, meeting people from all kinds of different organizations. We've talked to people who are trans. We've talked to gays and lesbians. We've been in conversations with very devout Christians, pro-life atheists on the other end of the, and we're all gathering under common cause, and have realized that. I mean, I exist in a very polarized mindset for quite some time, and it seems easier right now to find common in the middle, because I think there's more that we have in common than we have differences broadly. And
Yeah.
I think there is that middle coming up that's going to bring us together.
Well, the adults need to start adulting. That's how I feel. We need. I think it was Scott Nugent that said in our space that, yeah, we just need to start adulting better. And I really agree with that. I as somebody who's worked in climate change, that one of the narratives there is that the children are going to save us. They don't say it like this, but it's the idea that children are going to save the future. It's all about children saving the future. And, you know, we adults got us in this mess. I really feel it's us adults that need to do the adulting better and get us out of this mess and show the right example and not depend on, radicalizing our youth to somehow create some massive revolution and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
anyway, that is
Well,
a whole other thing.
the numbers seem to be indicating that, right? Like these radical activists tend to be in the younger cohort,
Mhm.
and tend to in of the zealous activists, something like if you were a non-binary person, 60% chance you were a zealous activist, and the U35 under 35 women comprised a huge chunk, was the biggest single group in that zealous activist cohort. So we are like
Yeah.
we are imparting this activism on children, which is kind of scary because countries that have done this, I'm pretty sure that it was Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, and they trained up children in the education system and through a youthful indoctrination, and then the kids killed all the adults. Like
Yes.
they just genocided. We
Well,
think
because
about
children don't have the capacity. They're not fully formed adults. They are not, if they're not trained to think critically in a comfortable environment where they can grow up trusting their environment, they're going to get messed up. And so
yeah,
we're messing up our children with this critical theory, the praxis that we were talking about, right?
yeah.
It's
Well, we're
making the kids not okay.
yeah. There are no good examples where the state has proven itself to be a competent parent in
Mm,
history. There just aren't any. When we look at the capture of educational institutions, we can look at the Hitler Youth. And what we learned from history is that children were taught to rat out on their parents who weren't complying with the Nazi ideology, or who said the wrong thing at home at the dinner table. Right? Children canceling their parents, and I experienced that. Right? I was cut out of my
well, and
child's
don't
life.
don't forget the Red Army.
Right? Absolutely. We've got the Red Army. The Maoist Cultural Revolution, the eliminating the four olds, basically memory holing the past, in China to embrace the new communist utopia, and Maoism. The genocides in Africa and child soldiers, and this
Yeah.
never ends well. So we, as defiant objectors, have an important role to play, and I'm hopeful that we're seeing this snowballing sentiment and just getting the breakdown about culture in Canada, and recognize that, hey, wait a second, you're the minority here. Why are you people running school boards, and why are you people running unions and controlling our kids when 80% of the country does not agree with you? Hopefully we
Yeah.
can get some intervention here. Now, Melanie, before we go, I want to promote some of the things that are coming up this week, and some of the people who are leading these events. So on the 20th, coast to coast, if you want to find out a place near you where there's going to be a march and a gathering of parents, and you want to meet other people like you, be prepared to take names, shake hands, say hello to people. They tell you, if you're following the antihate.ca methodology for protesting, cover your faces, make sure you don't get photographed, go with a buddy, but don't talk to anybody else, don't talk to media. You know what? Go and talk to people. Have
Yeah.
conversations with others. Show your faces, shake hands, look people in the eye. This is how we build trust in community. All of those people who are there that are protesting against this are going to be like-minded. Doesn't matter if they're Christian, whether they're gay, whether they're trans, whether they're a mom or a dad, a grandparent, or a student. These are all people who care deeply about the country that we live in and care
And
deeply about our kids.
and they're regular people. That's the thing. They're regular average citizens for the most part, right?
Yeah,
And that's really important to
it's
say.
been a long time since we've had something big enough that motivates this number of people across the country. Now, I don't know if there'll be 1 million people. Maybe we get 100,000. Uh, Maybe the Million for Children March becomes an annual event, as and a rallying point. Now, on the 21st, you and I are going to be in Windsor. I'm going to be in Ottawa for the 20th, by the way, and I think you're going to be in Toronto. Some
Yeah, I wanted to mention that I'm going to be in Toronto, and I'm going to be trying to speak to people on camera. So I have the resilience, obviously, as my other podcast, and I speak to people anonymously. But I would love to, if you came up to me, like Shannon said, come up to me and speak to me, and have a little conversation. Tell me why you're there and what you'd like to share. And I think I'd like to do a special little episode of the resilience, speaking to the public in Toronto. So yeah, I will be there,
Yeah, I think
and you'll be in.
I might do the same thing in Ottawa. Yeah. And then on the 21st, I, I'm carpooling with Mia Ashton. So I agreed to pick her up on my way to Toronto. And she said, well, what time are you going on Thursday? And I said, well, I'll probably, passing by where you are, like 7 o'clock. And she said, I'm going to block you. I think you're a white supremacist at 7 o'clock in the morning. I said, what about 5? And she said, transphobic bigotry.
Oh dear.
So 21st
Oh
in
dear.
Windsor, 21st in Windsor with Scott Nugent. Scott's an outspoken opponent of medicalizing children. He was the star of the show in the film What Is a Woman, produced by the Daily Wire. Melanie, myself, Pierre Barnes, and Scott Nugent will be presenting in that town hall. Looking forward to that event. And then on Friday morning, we're all convoying from Windsor up to Toronto for the Billboard Chris Elston and Josh Alexander. They're protesting there like they did in Ottawa in June. So a big week. And to cap it off back in Windsor on Saturday, if you're in that region, Heather Mason, a member of, I believe, founding member of Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, is holding a Keep Prisons Single Sex rally in Windsor on Saturday. So, we got 4 big days next week. We've got 30 plus events happening across the country. Check out Blueprint for Canada. And you can find Blueprint for Canada on Twitter or go to their website. They've got listings of as many of the playbills from organizations that we could get. So you can find out what's happening close to you and at what time. The general consensus seems to be, if you're not going to go to a protest, but you can keep your kids home, keep your kids home. If you can go to a protest gathering at 9, I'm taking the day off work. I'm taking a couple of days for this actually, because this is a big thing for me. And join the protest at 9. There's a march at 11 in most communities, and there'll be organizers there to help sort things out. And stay safe. Have a great time. Don't bother engaging with the immovable activists if they're going to be yelling and causing problems.
Yeah.
It's going to be an interesting test to see how much opposition they can mobilize.
Yeah, I would very much strongly suggest that. I think it was Billboard Chris that kept saying for the Ottawa protest, if you're going to show up, don't fight back. Just be present, speak to people, engage, but don't be provoked. They may try to provoke, but we're not there to provoke. We're there to show our own solidarity in opposing this issue. But we're also there to meet other like-minded individuals, because quite often we feel like we're alone feeling this way. And the truth is, you're not.
Not at all.
So, yeah. And I would also like to say, to underline what you said, if you can, keep your children at home. We have seen a lot of adverts for counter protests, and we simply do not know the numbers or what that's going to look like. So far, police have been very helpful, it seems, but you just don't know. And so use your discretion. Perhaps that is not something that you would like to do. But yeah, please keep your kids at home too. That's very, very, very important. I know Shannon said, but I'm just saying that again.
Yeah.
So yeah.
One last thing I'm going to add, and along the way, I met a pretty incredible woman. I won't name her. She's a therapist. She spent a long time in the education system working with kids, and she's also a lesbian activist. Grew up in Montreal, moved to Toronto in the early 80s. The whole gay and lesbian liberation, like she was there for all of the pride activism in the 80s and 90s, right? And she mentioned to me about some of these protests and parades and events. They always had parade marshals or protest marshals. And what I mean by that is people who are willing to check your own side. She said,
They had
"We
those in the UK for those for the women's let women speak.
yeah," and that's to say, if someone on our side, is drunk or high or causing a problem, or they're getting themselves out of hand, it's up to us to kind of give them space, help to bring them down, help to disengage them from causing problems. We don't want to have any issues coming from this. Well, we want it to be a peaceful protest. We want to communicate the concern that we all have,
Yeah.
and it's possible that there are agitators as well, and so we need to be able to police ourselves, um, because that's certainly not something that the radical activists do. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
you are describing adulting better. Absolutely.
Indeed. Any last comments this week, Melanie?
That was it for me. I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned keeping your kids at home as we finished. That was my last point. So that's
Yeah,
it from me.
and likewise. Well, it's been a big week in the Canadian gender wars. We've gone a little over our time from 30 minutes, but so much to cover. And next week we're going to be shooting. We'll probably do a couple of segments of the Gender Wars Report and the Resilience podcast, because when Melly and I met in Toronto a few months ago, I said it's kind of going to be like a convention. Like, we could call it a convention, because there's going to be 12, 14, 16 people staying in an Airbnb together. We're coming from across the country. We're going to be sharing ideas. We're going to be interesting personalities and people who've long been making contributions to this effort there. So we'll be bringing our lights and cameras and having conversations with people, and sharing their feedback on the event. So everybody have a terrific, safe week. We look forward to seeing you at protests across the country, and we want to send a message, and we're glad that you're participating to help us do it.
Yeah, can't wait till next week. Thank you, Shannon.
Great chatting as always, Melanie.
Cheers.